Nobody really expected Super Mario Bros. To be the smash success it was. Real effort and thought was put into it, but let's be honest, Nintendo was still kind of moving their way through things at the time with the Famicom. But it took off, and it took off here in the States. The response was so positive that pretty much most of the core Nintendo development team sat down and said, let's make a sequel. So they retooled the engine a little bit, fixed it up, and pushed out Super Mario Bros. Lost Levels, which I'll be referring to as this way henceforth, because of course I will. I'll talk about that more in a minute. Just come back to that. So, okay, Lost Levels. Cool. And then they started pushing it out to the States. Now, at the time, there was something kind of unusual about Nintendo of America. Now, to my knowledge, this is still true. But NOA actually had unheard of independence when it came to making decisions with regards to games in that particular market. Now, this made sense. The United States market was substantially different than the Japanese market when it came to video games, especially since we had just been smashed in the face with the Atari crash. I shouldn't actually call it the Atari crash, but you know what I'm talking about. The echoes of that crash reverberate throughout the United States market in terms of both people and customers and perceived faith, and affected a lot of business decisions as well as creative decisions for about a decade afterwards, and this is no exception. That's important, because what they did was they looked at this and they said, no. This is effectively a niche game. It's an expansion for all intents and purposes. It did have a different engine, but it didn't look like it. And so you put that on the shelves and people are going to think, well, it's Super Mario Brothers again, or I don't know, it's some kind of like Super Mario Brothers U, right? Like that we can't just put this on the shelves as is. So NOA vetoed this being released in the West. It is worth noting that the difficulty was, at last, something that was actually considered to be relevant. I point that out because many people tend to like to think that the Japanese are like, the Americans can't play our difficult games. And every time that comes up with a particular game, I do my due diligence and try to research it, and I find out that, no, that's actually not the truth or not related. Some people think that, of course, and individual people will make responses about that, but that's the realm of unproven rumor. In this case, it was specifically the difficulty and the fact that it didn't look like a new game that were the two figures that made them say, no, we're not going to release this in NOA. So like, okay, sure, whatever. Meanwhile, Kensuke Tanabe was working on a team with a little-known person named Miyamoto, and they were working on this brand new game idea, which was supposed to be another Mario Brothers. The whole concept was you'd have these blocks, and it was all this vertical game, and it was two-player co-op, and you'd sit down, and you'd place the blocks, and you'd jump up them, and you use that to slowly climb your way up this area. And they said, well, that's kind of neat, but it's kind of boring. There's nothing to it. It's just placing blocks and doing vertical platforming. It's neat from a conceptual level, but there's not much to it. So they just kind of shelved that game and its engine and just kind of sat it over there. And then Mr. Tanabe was pulled aside. Now, important note. Nintendo nowadays is kind of like Disney, for good and for bad. But in the good sense, it's because Nintendo is Nintendo. They can afford to do whatever they feel like. Not just in terms of finances, but in terms of weight and customer service and customer support. And neither of those what I mean. Customer trust is what I actually meant. Sorry. Customer trust, support, all of the pieces that are in place, they are very well entrenched and established. Nintendo, back in the mid-'80s, was not quite as established. And there's also the problem of a gentleman who I will not name here, who was still making some interesting calls. So the company had a tendency in the 80s to the 90s to jump on every single lifeline that was thrown at it. You know what this is like, right? Someone bigger or more famous or otherwise other than you reaches out to you saying, hey, do you want to do a collaboration? And your response is, yeah, of course, because you're the dinky small person, right? And this was kind of the attitude at the time. Not helped by the president, whose name I will once again not be repeating, but you get the point. So they jumped on this idea when the Fuji television studio reached out to them and said, hey, we want to do a video game to help promote the 87, I'm definitely pronouncing this wrong, Yume Kojo Festival, okay? We want this to be a big deal. Make a game. And they were like, well, we do have that prototype, the vertical building game. So why don't we just make, let's call it what it is, a Mario game out of that. So they did. This was, I want to rehash this, the core Nintendo development team, the people who worked on Mario 1 and Mario Lost Levels. So they put together a Mario game. It obviously wasn't skinned as one and it wasn't portrayed as one, but this was the style, scope, and approach that they did when they made this game. Now the thing is, because of the fact, this is one of those little interesting things. because of the fact that it wasn't branded or intended to be a Mario game at this point in time, it also kind of wasn't. We've talked about these kind of sequels before. There's sequels that are... I keep forgetting the terminology. One of these days I'm going to come up with a codified terminology for this. There's sequels that are the next thing, but a little bit more, like Return of the Jedi. And then there's sequels which are completely different direction, like Empire Strikes Back. So Super Mario Bros. 2 was completely different direction. They could do whatever they wanted with it. And they did. They made a lot of the games centered around the picking up and throwing mechanic. That was part of the original building up to vertically game, because that was the core gameplay of that game. So, okay, cool. We put that together. They called it Doki Doki Panic, and you've all heard this story before. Now, the thing most people don't seem to report on is then Nintendo of America was like, we're doing pretty well over here. We could use a Mario 2 that's actually, it's not the previous one. Okay, well, we got, what we could do? And they showed them Doki Doki Panic. Like, why don't we make this into Mario 2? Okay. And they did something that I give them credit for. They didn't just reskin it and transfer it over. There's a reasonably large list of things that were changed, and it's mostly minor stuff, all tiny little stuff. But the point is, they went through the game and thought about the design and polished it up and did let's call it what it is, did a remaster of it, a good remaster of Doki Doki Panic, turning it into Super Mario Bros. 2. And I'll always give them credit for actually putting some honest-to-God work involved. And this then sold like crazy here in the States. This is, to this day, technically the sixth, hang on. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah. Fifth best-selling Nintendo game, NES game ever. And functionally the second or third best-selling NES game ever. If you don't know what I mean by that, you see my NES over here? This came bundled with Duck Hunt. So Duck Hunt is the second best-selling NES game ever because of that technicality. I don't think that counts, personally. So if we remove the bundles, Mario 2 is way up there. And even if you don't, Mario 2 is way up there. 7.46 million sales. That's nothing to sneeze at. In fact, some of you probably remember that it was hard to get a hold of Mario 2. I got lucky. My copy was one of those rental places that would sell you the rental. I don't have that copy anymore. As I think I've mentioned a few times, I was forced to sell the collection, so I had to buy a new copy, which is the one that is right here. But you're probably wondering, why did it sell so well? Well, in my opinion, there are three big reasons why. Reason number one, it was Mario Bros. 2. And there was definitely a hungry, growing market for video games, especially since the previous market had failed so badly because of the aforementioned crash. So games that are, let's call it what it is, actual games, were definitely things that people wanted more of. Reason number two, marketing. How many of you remember the Nintendo Power issue number 1, which had Super Mario Bros. 2 in the in the clay figures thing, right on the cover? Nintendo Power has a fairly regular history of pretty much boosting the sales of any game that it features, and this is no exception. But reason number 3, and this is probably going to sound familiar to you if you've heard me cover Mega Man, is this right here. Hang on, let me make sure that this is... Let me pull up my preview window so you can see here. There we go. There we go, right there, so you can see it without the glare. This is a nice, bright, shiny, colorful-looking cover. And remember, that was one of the biggest reasons why Mega Man 2 sold so well and why Mega Man 1 didn't. So, we've got a Mario Bros. 2 with a big marketing stint, with a growing market, and a nice big cover so that even people who aren't a part of any of that are still looking at that and saying, I want to play that game. That's why I picked it up for the first time. And, of course, there was a rental. Dad, can I rent this one? And here it is. So this game sold like gangbusters. In fact, it sold so well. Honest question, how many of you were around at the time and remember how hard it was to get a hold of a copy of this game? People were selling out left and right. Now, thankfully, they had the know-withal and the experience to say, okay, we need to do another print. We need more cartridges. This is selling out like crazy. But still, it was interesting for those first few months there when this sucker came out. I suppose I should go ahead and talk about the game itself, but it's interesting how much of this game started trends within the Mario franchise. Most of the personality of the main 4 characters arguably starts here. I know it's all little gameplay stuff, but Peach and her hover, Luigi and his squigginess, as well as his jump height, and of course Toad in his speed and his strength, being the only person who doesn't have a detriment to his speed when he's running. In fact, he has the opposite. All of that started with this game, and it kind of helped to inform what would eventually be the Nintendo Adventure comics, which is when their personalities codified, and all the RPGs and stuff would carry that forward after that point. So that's cool. I'm with that. And I want to say that this game is actually very impressive for the time. But before I go any further, I got to talk about something. I hinted at this earlier. Every time I bring up this game and mention it on camera, or today when I was streaming it, people jump up and make the usual jokes. You know the usual jokes. Which one do you mean? Doki Doki, or do you mean Super Mario Bros. 2? Or maybe they mention that, oh my gosh, this used to be Whatcha-Fig, or did you know this was actually originally a different game? You get the idea, and almost everyone likes to repeat that information ad nauseum. It's interesting. So I'm not going to try to prevent you. Go ahead. Get it out of your system. But I do have a real question, which I have more interest in seeing comments on. Before watching the rest of this video, and or with the caveat of not replaying this recently, what do you remember about this game? Positive, negative, is it good, bad, fond memories, stuff like that. The reason I ask that is because this game has 4 playable characters, each of whom play differently, which is impressive for the time. And it's got a nice, colorful presentation, and it's a decent soundtrack for all 7 songs that are in the game, 2 of which are actually quite good. And the level design, we'll talk about that in a minute, and so forth and so on. And of course, well, this game blows most of the other games at the time out of the water. But you've probably already caught on, because you've probably been listening to me to use the phrase "at the time" several times now. Mario 2, I remember fondly, to answer my own question to you, mostly because of the fact that it was just so much better than anything else at the time. Not just technically, but in terms of design. They did so much more than nobody else was even trying to do. That's pretty standard for Nintendo, let's be honest, but it's still true. And this was such a leap forward, specifically from Mario 1. So if we look at Mario 1 and look at this game is just so much improved over Mario 1 in several respects. So, yeah, no, it's a great game, right? And that's the catch. Now, I knew I wasn't going to walk into this game scoring it particularly highly, because I replayed this game semi-recently, just last year, actually. And I've kind of already known where this was going. Because for however impressive this game was for the time, I don't think it holds up particularly well. The first and most glaring issue is the controls. This game is bizarrely physicsy. Probably because of the fact that you're intentionally supposed to be going up, and the whole original mechanics and physics engine were designed around that. But once you actually get into the game, it is weirdly easy for the game to just kind of physics you to death. Anybody who watched my claw grip fight can attest to that one. But there's also just a weird squirreliness to it, which anybody who's played this knows exactly what I'm talking about. It's slippery. It's even more slippery if you're playing as Luigi. And so it's just landing on someone is something that takes some work and effort. Now, this is on top of the usual Mario problem, so it's actually magnified. Let me explain what I mean by that. I usually divide, there's actually like 17 categories of platformers, but there's 3 kinds that we talk about most regularly. There's commit platformers, precision platformers, and Mario platformers. Commit platformers is like Castlevania, for example, or Ghouls and Goblins. You make the jump, and there's nothing you can do. You are now locked out of control until that jump finishes. You have committed to the jump. A precision platformer is like Mega Man. It's you have total control of the movement, and it's very precise, and there's no momentum involved. You make the jump, and you have total control of that jump. Then we have Mario platformers. Mario platformers have a bit of momentum to them, and they've done this since 1, and they do this all the way up to Odyssey, although to varying degrees based on the game. Now, I don't like that personally, partially because I've never been good at it, and I freely admit that I'm not that great at Mario games. There's only a couple of exceptions to that. But we add on top of that the squirreliness. So we're already having momentum, and then we have just the squirrely nature of it. And then we had ice physics. At one point I was showing off on camera just how far you'd glide on the ice physics. It's like a screen, almost a full screen of distance. It's ridiculous. The game controls kinda oddly. The second thing, though, that really kind of bothers me about this game is the penalty for failure. Now, Mario Bros. 1 doesn't have this issue, interestingly enough, but in Mario Bros. 2, you have X lives, And when you die, you go back to the last checkpoint. Now, this is something the game does very rightly. Pretty much every time you have a load screen, you do a transition to a new area, that's a checkpoint. So if you die, you go back there. So you rarely lose any time on deaths. Pretty impressive for an NES game, I must say. However, if you game over, you go back to the beginning of the world. That's okay. That makes sense. Again, penalty for failure needs to be there, so I'm kind of with that with regards to a design. I'm cool. If you run out of continues on game overs, you start the game over. You go all the way back to 1-1. That is terrible. There's no way to get new continues, too. There's a way to get new lives, but not continues. That's awful. And I honestly think, and I mean this legitimately, that between the controls and the continue problem, that is the biggest issue with this game right there in those 2 bullet points. The controls make the game kind of squirrely, and until you get used to it, and you can get used to it, obviously. People speedrun this game, for God's sakes. But until you get used to it, you feel like you're not quite in control, and it's really easy to screw up, especially on minor things, and die to little nothings. Never mind the actual hard stuff. Anybody who watched the stream that I just did can attest to the fact that I generally didn't die on the hard stuff. I died because, whoop! And that was pretty much all of my deaths in this game. I did put up the cheat flag for this to use save states to avoid this problem, but you don't have to. So, first of all, if you're playing this on the Switch, you have access to save states and the rewind feature, which would help. But more to the point, the SNES version has a slightly better version of the continue system, which I'm not going to cover right now. That is the All-Stars version. But the GBA version, weirdly enough, one of the changes in the GBA version for new Super Mario Bros. Advance, I think is what they call that, is when you continue, you go back to the world you were at, and you don't run out of continue. So there's no start the game over. There's no screw you, go all the way back to the beginning kind of a mechanic in there. And that by itself makes that version of the game substantially more playable, in my opinion. Now, I'm only talking about negative stuff. Surely the game does some stuff right? Of course it does. This is the core Nintendo team. So let's talk about some of the things they do right. One of my favorite little tidbits is the very beginning of 1-1. I know I said this back in Mario Bros. 1, but it's still true here. You start off, and you're spawned at a thing where there's no platform. Therefore, the only thing that can happen, the only thing, is that you can fall as you go back and forth, trying to control your fall. Now, your first reaction, especially if you're playing this as a kid, is probably, but that's okay, because there's a place you can land, and then you're safe. And more to the point, you don't die when you hit the bottom of the screen. This does 2 things very quickly. It informs us of how to control our character in midair, probably by accident, and it tells us that the game scrolls vertically. With that one very simple trick, it now shows us exactly how the game functions. Then there's an enemy down there. Now, from this point, they're probably relying on you having played Super Mario Bros. Or another video game before. But what's one of the things you do to defeat enemies in Super Mario Bros.? You jump on them. So you jump on the enemy, nothing happens. But nothing happens to you either. You don't take damage. You're just sitting there on the enemy as it's pathing back and forth. It's a pink Shy Guy. Okay. Now, this is only really true for this version, but one of the things that's really common for Super Mario Bros. Players is to hold down the B button, or whatever the run button is, in order to run. Well, therefore, one of the things that's semi-likely to happen as you're trying to leave this guy is you hit that button in order to run off of him. In the doing so, you pick him up. There also happens to be another Shy Guy just down there, which you can then throw him into in order to find out how that works, or you could just throw him in general. There's also a little tuft of grass, which gathers your attention, but may or may not be a thing. But my point is, within 3 screens, they have very quickly tutorialized most of the function of the game just like that, without a single line of text, and that is awesome. If you pay attention to this game, and this is what this game does well, the game tutorializes itself all the way up to 3-3. At every stage as you're going through there, it's telling you something new by virtue of how it's introducing it. Okay, you've gotten through that. So here's some Shy Guys coming at you. There's also some trees and some plants in the background. Now, as a kid, the first thing I did was tried to pick up the trees. Didn't work. But then I tried to pick up the plants. And the moment I confirmed I could pick up the plants, that was a proven thesis now. So first, maybe it's a thing. Maybe you can only pick up enemies. But now that I can pick up the plants, well, now I try to pick up everything. And what's in the first stage? There's a whole lot of stuff to pick up. There's the plants, obviously, which you can pick up. There's the POW block just ahead, which you can then throw. Shortly before that, there's a vine, which you can climb up. Okay, that's pretty easy to do. And when you land there, there's 4 tufts of grass. The one nearest you is a potion. Okay, that's strange. When you throw it down, enter the door that shows up, and what do we now have is the mushroom, which gives you 1 extra health. And we can pick up the other things, which gives us coins. You see what I mean? This is all basic stuff, but it is still good. And the enemies slowly escalate. In fact, 4-1 is the last stage that introduces a new enemy into this game, as well as, I think, the last mechanic, with one exception to that. That's the conveyor belts in 7-2. So, at every point in the game, as you're moving through it, we drift more and more to the side and away from the center of the camera, and also towards understanding what we're playing and how. The catch, the difficulty here, is that unlike some other Mario games, including 3 and World, there's only one stage that really jumps out at me, and that is 7-2. For the most part, the stages are just there. It's short, it's sweet, and it's well tutorialized, and it can be really frustrating to go through because the 2 big problems I've already mentioned. So you get through, and it's like, okay, that's cool. I want to try the other players. And this is where we get into that difference. Now, the manual actually covers this, but as usual, we don't really cover the manuals in the reviews. But even in the game makes it very clear you can change your 4 characters every stage. So you're not locked into one, which is also kind of impressive for the time. So, okay, we're going to pick that one or that one or that one or that one. We'll do this one this time. Okay. And just by playing, you'll be able to figure out fairly quickly what the difference is between them. Mario is average. Okay. Luigi is squirrely as hell. He has what we call the squiggity. Because squiddy. But he jumps really high. He is also affected more by carrying stuff than Mario is. Then we have Toad, the speedrunner of choice, because Toad is fast and strong. He doesn't have a good jump, and he doesn't have particularly interesting anything else, except he is almost utterly unaffected by carrying stuff in a game all about carrying stuff. Then we have Peach. Peach is fascinating because she has the worst stats across the board. Worst jump, worst speed, most affected by carrying things in both jump and speed. But she can hover. And the way this hover works is once you leave the ground, you have one hover stored. You can activate that hover wherever. Full height, half height, as you're falling, doesn't matter. Once you have it, you can hold it down for up to 1.5 seconds. Once you let it go, that charge is expended. So if you hold it down for 1 frame and then let go of it, you don't get it back. You don't get the other, what would that be? 89 frames of hover. It's just gone. But because of how much additional control this gives her, she has enormous reach, for lack of a better way to put it. The amount of areas she can reach both horizontally and vertically, geez, I can talk, is astounding because of this, because she can do things like this, or she can do more precise maneuvers. Like if you have to go under, she can actually do this and just go straight in, etc., etc. There's a lot of different ways in which this changes the gameplay rather substantially. I would say her and Luigi are probably the 2 biggest game changers when it comes to actual playstyle. Peach also offers a lot of recovery because of the fact that if you screw up a jump, you have a chance to recover it. It's not a guarantee either. How many of you back in the day used to just play this game as Peach? And that's not actually true. I would rotate back and forth between everyone except for Mario. It depends on the stage. Some stages I prefer this character, some stages it just depends, right? Actually, for the middle section of the levels up until about 4-1, I usually prefer Toad, to be completely honest. But anyways. So yeah. So all of this sounds like some good stuff, and it is. It's just, well, the problem is really that for all of it does, for the digging sections. By the way, how many of you used to dig up all the sand as much as you could back in the day? In fact, one time I got myself stuck. You have to dig down, and then there's a door, and I'm like, oh shoot, I can't get back up. Now, if you go into the door and you go out, the sand gets refilled. But for a second there, I'm just like, oh god, what do I do? I can't leave this pit. For the sand, and for the clever usage of enemy placement, and for the fact that the enemies kind of don't quite Ninja Gaiden respawn, but because they're active off camera, so they can interact with you when you're on camera, for the secrets and shortcuts, which have absolutely nothing tutorializing that they're there whatsoever. For all of the cool stuff this does, it just kind of feels like a thrown-together game in several ways. It feels like a very well-designed, thrown-together game. Like imagine a 4-star or a 5-star chef who's absolutely top of their game, who makes just a Snickers or a McDonald's sandwich. It's just something really, really basic, like a grilled cheese. There we go. Grilled cheese or scrambled eggs, something very basic. It's good, and you can tell it's good, but at the same time, you're like, it's just grilled cheese. And at the end of the day, that's my thoughts on Mario Brothers 2. certainly an improvement and a divergence from Mario 1. And if I'm being blunt, probably something we needed. It sold very well, so well, in fact, that the developers took attention to that and started taking some of those concepts of, well, maybe we should try stuff rather than just making a level pack for Mario 1. And I mention that because I think, this is my opinion, but it's my opinion that this game is by far the biggest reason we got this game. Yes, I know Mario 3 was already in development when this was being made, but I stand by my point firmly. Because Mario 3 and World and 64 and all that continued that idea from 2 of trying stuff, of branching out and making something that isn't just the same game, but a little bit better. Now, that would stop right about when the new series came in, but let's not talk about that. They at least continued that for quite a while. And arguably they still continue that today because Odyssey is freaking amazing. Hope you've enjoyed my thoughts. It's going to be a couple days before we get to 3 because of the conveniences of schedule, but I do hope to see you when we cover 3 and World. See you around.